research ethics? Well, the short answer is that whenever we're doing research that involves interacting with people, we need to make sure that we don't hurt them, we don't cause them any harm, mental or physical, and also that we don't put ourselves in risk. And that seems fair enough. Except things do get complicated quite quickly because one of the complicating factors is, particularly with the rise of digital media, there are different definitions of what a human subject is. So, for example, one of the big controversial areas over the last decade or so has been the question of social media posts and whether or not you need ethical permission to use things that people have said on social media. And the answer to that quite often is that you do, or you at least need to think about the rights to privacy of people who are posting on social media, even when what they're doing can be read by anybody. But we can get to that a little bit later. But the first thing to recognize is that I suppose a couple of things. Firstly, that ethics procedures have been historically driven by the medical and the social sciences. So, to understand why we have the ethics procedures that we do, why we have to fill out the questionnaires that we do, we need to understand how ethics emerged from some horrific violations of human rights by in the medical sciences and the social sciences that happened in the 20th century. And we need to understand how many of the procedures that we engage with today, when we're doing something as apparently innocuous as researching a social media user, reflects some of the major abuses of human rights that happened within the sciences during the 20th century. And this really kicks off in 1945 with the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, of course, which were the trials which were established by the victorious Allied forces at the end of World War II, that tried Nazis for war crimes. And one of the things that became a major topic within the Nuremberg trials were the use of people in concentration camps for medical experimentation. So one of the many horrific realities of concentration camp of German Nazi concentration camps was that prisoners in these concentration camps were used for all kinds of barbaric medical experiments. And so one of the things that begins to happen is that after the Nuremberg trials, the United Nations and world bodies begin to think about, well, how could we at least put in place a framework of accepted practices that would create more of a sensitivity, an acknowledgement of human rights in medical research? Because up until that point, surprisingly to current ears and eyes, the question of the rights of medical patients wasn't really a question that anybody had asked. Why would we need to do this? You may look at this and think, well, yeah, but that was the Nazis, and these are fairly extreme cases. That wouldn't happen in other parts of the world, would it? Well, it would. Another one of the drivers behind the ambition to think explicitly and encode a set of practices about research and human rights were the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And these were a set of experiments that happened in the post-war period in the United States, where groups of African-American men who were suffering from syphilis were systematically denied treatment in order to let scientists analyze the progression of the disease over a series of decades. So there were groups of people in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments who believed that they were being treated for the disease, who in fact weren't being treated for their disease at all. And the argument at the time was that this research was necessary for the greater good, but obviously it was something that was done without the consent of the people in the study. And so this is an example of how the sort of the sort of human rights abuses that had, I suppose, first reared their heads in the Nuremberg trials were actually things that reflected medical practices in other parts of the world. So you begin to see in the post war period in medical science a consistent set of findings which are indicating that there needs to be some codification of the rights of people who participate in experimental research and in research. So, as we can see from these examples, a lot of this is driven by the needs of medical science. But in the 1970s, the social sciences come into the frame too. And this happens around Milgram's obedience studies. So there's actually a movie about the Milgram obedience studies. These were a set of studies by a very eminent social psychologist. And let me tell you what the study was. You see it, there's a still from the research here. And what the research was about, it's related to Nuremberg because there was a great deal of interest at this time in how ordinary people could have participated in the Holocaust. And this was seen as being really a question that struck to the center of human nature. Will people do whatever they're told to do by authority figures? Are there certain kinds of people who appear to be particularly susceptible to this sort of authority? And of course, this was a question that was very pertinent in the 1970s because the post-war period had seen trials of Nazi war criminals where the defense was often preferred that people were just following orders. I was just doing what I was told. So this raised, as a social scientific question, an interest in what are the conditions in which people can be ordered and will actually do things which go against their better nature. And this was what the Milgram obedience studies were about. And what these basically involved were groups of participants were asked to read a set of questions to what was called a research confederate. This was a person who seemed to be an ordinary person, but was actually working within the study. And every time the person got a question wrong, the person who was giving the quiz was ordered to give them an electric shock. Now, the shocks weren't real, but the person who was the researcher confederate pretended that they were. So whenever, and you can look this up on YouTube, it's kind of interesting to look it up, but what would happen is that the person would administer the electric shock, which wasn't really an electric shock, but the person who was working with the researcher would scream in agony. And every time the more questions the researchers confederate got wrong, the stronger the electric current the other person was required to give them. Now, one of the findings of this research was that people were largely willing to administer fairly strong electric shocks even when they were uncomfortable with doing so. They would keep on following orders. But this was deemed to be unethical because it was also seen to be incredibly upsetting for the people who were in the research. So they weren't actually hurting anybody, but they really were hurting people. Milgram argued that you couldn't really tell people the true nature of the research, otherwise the project wouldn't work. But this was seen as an unethical practice because the danger was that the people who were administering the shocks, who were the only people in the room who didn't know what was going on, would be basically traumatized. They could suffer some sort of trauma which would cause long-lasting damage. And so what we begin to see in reactions to the Milgram obedience studies is the idea that it isn't just the medical sciences which can harm participants in research projects. It's also the social sciences, because we're asking people to do things which can make them feel incredibly uncomfortable. and this can cause them emotional anguish that they have a right to be protected against, or at least they have a right to know what they're getting themselves into. So, those are the reasons why we have human ethics in place. Those are the reasons why sets of ethical concerns that began in the sphere of medicine began to transfer over to the social sciences. And in the next video, what I'm going to explain is how some of these questions about due diligence in terms of taking care of the people who we may research in the sphere of media use or media industries, how that transfers over to current ethical practices in digital media research.